The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon. This is Jack Rogers, Editor-in-Chief of Business Facilities Magazine. I'm speaking to you today from my home in Wayne Township, New Jersey. I want to welcome everyone to the third webinar of Business Facilities COVID-19 Response and Recovery webinar series. Before we get started, I know that everyone who's listening today wants us to take a moment to express our gratitude to America's healthcare workers who are waging a courageous and determined fight on the front lines against COVID-19. We thank all of these heroes. Before I introduce today's speakers, please take a look at the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions to us during the webinar. Using the question box on the panel, you can send in questions at any time and we'll try to answer as many as time permits. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of the panel. Clicking that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel. And in order to ask questions, you have to have the panel expanded. If you have any technical difficulties, just send us a message using the question box and someone on our team will answer you privately. And now let's meet the speakers for today's webinar, which is Predicting the Post-COVID World, and it's going to focus on the implications for site selection and economic development. Glen Weisbrod is the chairman of EBP US, a firm dedicated to advancing economic evaluation and analysis to support planning and policy in the areas of transportation, energy resources, urban development, and economic growth strategy. For nearly 4 decades, Glen has worked with clients in North America, Europe, and Asia on economic development planning and analytics that assess economic competitiveness, future development opportunities, and the effectiveness of investments to enable greater future economic growth. Glen will be joined today by EBP's senior economist, John Lee. John has experience evaluating state, regional, and municipal economic development and transportation policies. While working with the City of Boston, he participated in citywide and neighborhood-level economic development planning and planning initiatives. Well, without further ado here, we've got a lot to cover today, so let's welcome our speakers. Good afternoon, Glen and John.
Thank you, Jack. As we get started, I just wanted to throw up our agenda of what we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk about the economic conditions kind of leading up to today to kind of get a gauge of what is happening, and then transition into some of the trends that are leading up to the pandemic. From there, Glen will be talking about the implications for site selection, the economy, as well as the workforce. And then from there, we're going to be talking about some takeaways, and there'll be some time at the end for questions and discussion, and I believe in a couple points in the middle we may have some questions as well. So just to get started, I guess first we just want to kind of go over some of the kind of labor market conditions, and ultimately what we know at this point is that more or less the labor market conditions are pretty poor. We went from full employment in February of this year to levels that had not been seen since the Great Recession. We've actually, in the last 2 months, we've exceeded the peak of the monthly unemployment rates during the entire Great Recession. So it's kind of essentially an unprecedented time, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty. People are dropping in and out of the labor force. We also have kind of this, the robust gig economy is kind of being hurt by this, since there's really no kind of major contracts for those folks, and so it's potentially that we might be having a under measurement of the unemployment rate, where consensus might be actually closer to 19%. So kind of the current estimates right now may be on the more conservative side, and we also see that the Congressional Budget Office is projecting unemployment for the bulk of next year to be almost 10%. In this graph and all the preceding graphs, you'll see the recessionary periods of the past in kind of a shaded color. But the interesting part about this graph is showing the real magnitude of the unemployment levels as they are right now. that also presents the kind of opportunity to talk about the gap between a lot of the different sectors. There's these two factors of economic decline and social distancing, which are having an impact on various sectors of the economy and to varying magnitudes. Obviously, the necessities and e-commerce are up, but on the other hand, we have kind of brick and mortar as well as kind of higher priced commodities that are seeing major declines. And so as these two kind of factors happen in the duration of the kind of COVID crisis, we're going to see, varying differences between all these different sectors. This right here is the federal funds rate. It demonstrates kind of the low cost of borrowing and opportunities, during poor economic conditions, since the Federal Reserve, this is one of their major toolkits, which enables them to essentially set the federal funds rate, which allows private banks to borrow, in which case, right now they're trying to set the rate as close as possible to zero, in which case it enables higher capital flows circulating throughout the economy for consumers as well as businesses. This is one of their main toolkits. And it's basically, as you can see all through the different recessionary periods, the Federal Reserve would augment the federal funds rate to essentially move capital, allow for more borrowing, whether it's for operations, consumers, businesses to keep their doors open, and so forth. And so this is a kind of really important tool, but as you can see, as we're leading up towards 2020, with a strong economy, the rates were actually increasing, but now again, we're pushing it back down to zero. Other federal initiatives, including some of the stimulus programs, are again on the other side of that, trying to push money throughout the economy, and that's what we're trying to look at right now. On the other side of that is the rise of business apps. These, similar to e-commerce, have been on the rise, partially due to a lot of the kind of at-home time right now. Businesses are trying to communicate in real time, as we're doing today on a webinar. And so there's a distinct opportunity right here for business like this, that we're not expecting this kind of change during a type of recessionary period like we're experiencing right now. Other factors of the economic near term we wanted to discuss were some of the energy prices. Energy prices in the short term are showing fair stability for electricity, natural gas, and to some extent oil. Recently, in April, there was a bit of a hiccup where oil futures approached near zero, and then eventually actually went negative for the first time, in which case this presented a whole opportunity and movement for storage of crude oil. This was the largest kind of storage recorded since the Great Recession. It was about 160 million barrels, partially just to hold off until oil prices return to kind of a reasonable level, but also it just demonstrated how the shock of which this is happening to our current economy. But on the bright side is, so we now see in this kind of dotted line in the graph that oil prices are essentially returning back to normal. They're flattening out. And another aspect that's kind of important to this is that the U.S. is one of the top producers since 2018. And so these things are all stable. We don't have to necessarily worry about them in terms of other external shocks to the economy.
John, I noticed that you didn't have a slide charting the performance of the stock market. Do you consider it's still, the last time I checked, it's still defying gravity. Do you consider this an anomaly? Is it all that federal money going into buybacks, or does this speak to a fundamental strength that might impact on your other evaluations?
Thanks, Jack. That's a very good question. It's definitely a kind of light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that we are seeing businesses are still performing quite well, but I think the stock market performance doesn't necessarily present the case that's happening kind of in our main streets and kind of understanding what our local communities are experiencing. So if you're thinking about in terms of, investor returns and so forth, those are still fairly strong. But if you're looking at various subsectors, they may be performing at kind of different levels in terms of, maybe manufacturing.
But it's also going to impact on the ability of companies to spend money and have, the capital that they need, as long as their bottom line is doing well. So this could impact some of the other economic factors, couldn't it?
That's true, definitely. Glenn, do you have anything to add?
No, I think there's, that's partly a reflection of investor confidence and partly a reflection of the low cost of capital right now because of Fed actions. But when you talk about local economic development and site selection, I think there's a number of more fundamental differences occurring. And I think that's really what we're focusing on now, rather than looking at the national outlook. But that's a good point.
Please continue.
Thanks, Jack. So ultimately, what does this mean? We're talking about some of the aspects of the economy and kind of what has changed, in the near immediate term. And the question, I guess, is how does this affect planning for site selection decisions? To some extent, we're wondering if this actually changed the actual factors themselves, or if it's rather a reprioritization of these different factors of labor, energy, transportation costs, your access to markets, materials, as well as land. And so to some extent, the labor costs in terms of both unemployment, potentially skill mismatches, those will be an area for kind of future concern. But then also you're going to have the uncertainty of land pricing, whether there's financing going to be available. The Fed's actions are trying to make this capital available, but it's really up to the banks to actually then and investors to lend that money forward. So this was kind of one of the issues that had occurred in the 2008 recession when banks were recapitalized. To some extent, they held on to it. And so you can't really blame them for the sense that they were worried about future conditions, but it also kind of made the recovery period a little bit slower. Then the other side of this is what are the uncertainty factors, in terms of materials and costs. Suppliers, labor availability, all of these are questions right now, in which case could affect prices both positively and negatively, as we looked at fuel prices, which have essentially come down to prior, 2015 levels. And then in terms of what your future change in external, what are the market trends, which we're going to be talking about. Obviously the interest rates are low, which is definitely helpful. But then there's always this question of investor comfort and willingness to really Jack's question. And so there's also this kind of sense of the operations and scheduling. Will social distancing or square footage requirements also impact the actual layout of future facilities or even existing facilities? And then, of course, the questions of time to completion, whether this is actually the development itself in terms of zoning and the speed of appeals if necessary, or how those kind of specifications are handled. It could also even impact the timing of construction. In terms of kind of moving forward with external factors, the predictive analytics really, aren't really ready to respond to kind of predict this type of pandemic. However, I think they're more well suited to tell us our recovery in response to these type of factors and how they differ from prior economic shocks. Obviously there is a labor force uncertainty. We have these concerns about workplace conditions, whether it's safety equipment, how the workplace operates, do folks work from home if they can, but also the duration of, the outbreaks, what policy measures are put in place to fight it, and then the industries that are impacted. These all vary for a number of different reasons, and they could be questions of going back to social distancing, you could have a business that has very thin margins that may not be as resilient as other industries, in which case they have a high cost of operating and a high cost of potentially even not operating. And then also the potential changes in demand, whether your business is kind of a necessity, a supplier, or potentially kind of a luxury good. So what do these indicators tell us? All the information we've presented so far, typical of economic data, is that these are lagging economic indicators. The unemployment rate is between 4 to 6 weeks always behind. Other indicators could be as much as 8 weeks or more. And so you're trying to find the leading of the lagging indicators to really understand kind of how, or if there are any inflections in kind of the growth that we're seeing. It's a way to kind of speculate on the directionality of our economic growth, but it's very limited. You're just kind of looking at one point. And so we're more interested, I guess, in looking at kind of the patterns and understanding how prior trends may have reflected these types of changes. So looking back at things like the 2001 recession, Hurricane Katrina, the Great Recession, or even events like the Pacific Port close down. So these kind of are helpful in kind of understanding what's happening in the long run. And so we're going to look at some of these trends. One of the first ones that is kind of important to this discussion is reshoring trend and foreign direct investment. Prior to this, and reshoring was a kind of trend that was already happening. And some of the reasons were due to kind of the narrowing of the labor rates between American workers and other foreign workers. There's also been kind of some documentation of delays in shipping, production schedules, as well as quality concerns. At the same time, there's also been a significant amount of foreign direct investment in the US. Now, what this means is that there's been some narrowing of kind of like the manufacturing trade flows for the US and foreign countries. Now, the magnitude of which this is a huge difference, but we're kind of narrowing that gap, which I think is movement in the correct direction, and has been growing for a while. In 2016, it was the first time since the 70s that we saw a net influx of jobs coming back from foreign countries. So this is kind of the net change. So there's going to be flows in and out, but in terms of the difference, it was about 30,000 jobs. And so that trend has continued through 2020 and hopefully beyond. In terms of the long-term manufacturing and warehouse jobs, high-tech manufacturing was already growing in the period from after the Great Recession to about 2020. If you look at the gray shaded areas or blue shaded areas, those are the recessionary periods. The orange line is the transportation warehousing as well, which, as you can see, has had kind of an upward slow but upward trajectory that has minor variation during recessionary periods but continues on that same upward slope. In more recent years, the slope has kind of increased quite a bit, and that's partially due to kind of the growth of e-commerce and other types of online businesses shipping direct to consumers. But in terms of manufacturing, which is very surprising that you see this slight upward trend. Now, if you look nationally, manufacturing jobs has been declining for a number of reasons over time. Part of it's been a little bit of offshoring. There's also been productivity gains and capitalization. And so all of these factors kind of hurt the actual employment aspect of manufacturing, more so in some regions than others. But what I think is very important is that we've hit this point where it's flattening out and actually showing growth in very recent years. In terms of retail sales, you can kind of show some varying different sectors and how the gap is widening. The orange line represents department stores, the blue line, internet and mail order, which essentially is e-commerce, and then motor vehicles. What's been I think very telling from the blue and orange lines, which are the e-commerce and department stores, is that there has been a trajectory for mail order and internet services way before the Great Recession, and then after the Great Recession, you see it continue straightward up towards present. And to some extent, there's going to be an acceleration of that, the next couple quarters because of the way of our lives as we're consuming more through e-commerce. Whereas department stores have large capital costs. They have a large distribution networks, but they physically need you go to the store to then pick up. Obviously, there have been kind of new business models to kind of help bolster them in terms of curbside pickup and so forth, but ultimately they're paying a premium on real estate prices, and you kind of see this trend over the long run in a downward trend since the recession. Now, motor vehicles, on the other hand, is kind of an interesting case where obviously it's an expensive commodity, but as you see in 2007, 2008, major dip. During the recovery period, it kind of comes back at a trajectory, and perhaps there was kind of excess demand as people had delayed purchases of vehicles, whether you're for your personal or for businesses, in which case you see that demand kicking back up and returning to the original trajectory pre-Great Recession. Now, you're seeing a similar decline right now, and potentially even more exacerbated by the fact that we're all at home and these are expensive purchases, and therefore you're unlikely to, or maybe would delay a type of purchase like that with uncertainty. There's also the question of whether people are comfortable with purchasing a vehicle, such a large investment online. So those are all kind of valid concerns, and I think that's going to be an important industry to watch to see if, the lessons from the prior recession was that they would hold more cash on hand, and how long that lasts is a question. In terms of kind of more tech related, some industries are definitely showing to be more resilient. Telecom, the orange line, has been showing kind of a slow decline over the past 20 years, and partially that is due to changes of productivity. You see reclassification in some of those industries as kind of wireless becomes its own thing, and internet service. They potentially have a lot of contract workers, but also there was a lot of consolidation of companies in the 90s and recently. On the other hand, you see kind of research and data processing sectors growing quite, slowly, but they're showing positive growth and very steady throughout good and bad times. And so it's going to be very interesting to watch those. And the nice thing about those industries now is that they can essentially be anywhere where there's kind of good infrastructure and a skilled labor force. So that's kind of a potential industry to kind of look for and kind of think about. I mean, there is a tendency for clustering of those certain industries, but as we kind of changing our minds about how we work and locations, density might be something that is less desirable, particularly with real estate costs factored in. In terms of tourism and accommodation, these are really the hardest hit industries at the moment, and they have by far some of the most vulnerable workforce segments. Hotel obviously has high capital costs. They typically require lots of investment, and they're very susceptible to downturns. Particularly if you think of the Northeast, there are been growth and fair amount of resort casinos, and so there's kind of potentially a cannibalization of the market in some regards, but also other types of leisure opportunities. If economic decline and potential recessions are in folks' minds, they're less likely to spend that money. Add in the layer of social distancing, this really presents large problems. Another kind of related sector would be restaurants, which, up until this point from the Great Recession had an average growth of 2.5% per year. And those, again, are also going to be hard hit because of all this. And again, their workforce has a very limited skill set. So there's going to be difficulty for those segments of the labor force but also it'll be potentially opportunities for retraining for other sectors. But in the short term, that's the question, is how we kind of make that work. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Jack for a second.
John, let's talk about a couple of these trends, and in particular, and these are the trends that were impacting on site selection decisions before the crisis hit. Everybody was looking at increases in automation. Everybody was predicting the end of the big box stores, and the reshoring was growing, and FDI was surging. Do you think, which of these trends do you think are going to be accelerated by what and for the purposes of this discussion, I understand you really can't, I mean, it's an unprecedented situation, so it's very hard to predict how it's going to end. But assuming that, and I'm sure everybody hopes this is true, that we get some kind of a vaccine by the end of the year, and also hopefully that it's more of a V-shaped than a U-shaped recovery, which of the trends are going to be impacted the most by what we're going through here? Is it the idea that the companies have maintained productivity remotely? Maybe they rethink office space. Maybe the shopping mall is a thing of the past. Maybe there is more automation. Which of these trends do you think are most likely to speed up as a result of this?
Jack, that's a great question. To some extent, I think all of those will kind of accelerate it to some degree. Anytime you open the paper, in recent weeks, you hear about a number of retailers, particularly large retailers and legacy retailers, that are filing for Chapter 11 or kind of having stories about their kind of losses, quarterly losses. So the real question is going to be the cost, I think, of for these retailers to stay open, and whether or not the mall is really a thing of the past. Now, whether that reemerges post vaccine, that's a whole another question. But in terms of I really have a feeling that physical retail is going to be hit very hard, and particular since they usually have the most expensive real estate. And if you think about urban areas, there's many storefronts that are going to be likely empty. And from a lot of the discussions,
the people that were shopping there are used to buying things online now, so maybe they like the convenience.
Right. Well, this maybe is the perfect segue into the section. This is Glen, where I'm going to take over. To go forward on addressing exactly these issues as Jack's laid them out and as John's introduced them. So let me talk for a minute about, this is where predictive analytics comes in, because when it comes to what are the shifts in demand and what are the supply responses, we can learn a lot from information that John has just laid out. The combined information about the current facts about what the COVID-19 effect has been, and the historical facts about trends and how we've seen the response to past economic shocks. This will give us a very good idea of what going forward. And we can use advanced statistics and inference to predict the most likely opportunities and risks. So let's go on to the next slide.
Glenn, could I just ask you a quick question? Sure. Because I didn't want to let it pass, because on one of your charts you were showing reshoring and FDI both tracking upward at the same time.
Right.
Don't you think it's likely, particularly because we're not just talking about reshoring of facilities now, we're talking about entire industries that may come back, for in particular pharmaceuticals, medical supplies.
Yes.
We can't leave ourselves in that situation. And then there's the untangling of the sort of symbiotic relationship with China. Don't you think that it's safe to predict that FDI is going to start declining?
Well, historically, the FDI has varied, partly reflecting not only global economy, which of course is now lagging, but also the politics that we've had about restrictions and tariffs on imports and tariffs that other countries have had back. And clearly we're in an era where the tariffs have jumped up from what they have now. Going forward in the future, and we're trying to talk about the next 5 or 10 years, if the existing U.S. position on tariffs remains and increases, then yes, that'll be a problem with FDI. If in fact the situation changes in the next 5 or 10 years, it may be a very different story. So I think FDI is hard to predict, but the reshoring, actually, we're going to talk about in a minute. So I don't know if I should go on the reshoring.
No, go ahead, Glenn.
Okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. This is perfect, and it was a perfect introduction, and these are exactly the right issues. So let's go to the next slide. So what we have here is a bunch of industries that John's has been talking about, and Jack's been talking about as well: the e-commerce, the telecommuting, telemedicine, reshoring. These are all things that have had an upward trend, which you see on the red. Now, what's going to happen in the future? What's happened recently and in the future, you can see by the blue. Let's take the first group of e-commerce, telecommuting, and telemedicine. As you see, they got a big bump upward with COVID-19. They were already growing, and they're going to continue to grow. And COVID-19 put them ahead of where they otherwise would have been. But eventually, it'll catch up and it'll converge to the original trend. And the reason why is that there are technical limits to adoption of e-commerce, e-community, telemedicine. In other words, there's always going to be some kinds of manufacturing, some kinds of repair, and some kind of medical procedures that require you to be in person. So these industries clearly are on an upward trajectory and clearly will converge. On the other hand, the other group, like reshoring, self-supply, effects on imports, that was also got highlighted. Now, it was already on an upward trend. The problems were highlighted of resilience in supply chains, about food stores, medical supplies. And there's been a change in attitudes. There's a more understanding of the needs for redundancy and resilience in those industries. So the modeling suggests that those industries not only got a bump up from COVID-19, but they'll be on a different trajectory than they originally would have been because there's more understanding of the resilience issues. So that is how we would put that. While we cannot talk about FDI, we can talk about the reshoring and resilient supply chains as an issue that clearly has gotten a boost. Now, besides having a group that's accelerated and a group that's just got a advanced push, let's move on to the next and see the ones that have more negative impacts. Now, on the left, you see some other industries: renewable energy, development of urban centers, autonomous vehicles, tourism, restaurants, cruise lines. All of these had a positive trend in the future. COVID-19 gave them all a kick downward instead of upward in the prior ones. But again, we can distinguish between the category of those that were delayed and those that are decelerated. The first few that you see, renewable energy, autonomous vehicles, we used to hear a lot about that. All of a sudden, it became quiet. Those were just put on ice. They were put on hold. They will bounce back. They will bounce back at probably the same trend they had before, but they were delayed. And because they're delayed, they will continue to be behind where they would otherwise would have been in terms of their development and adoption. Now, the second group, cruise lines, tourism, dine-in restaurants, they got a big kick downward, but they're not necessarily going to recover ever to be the same as they were because there's changes in attitudes and values. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but that suggests that they're on a different trajectory and it may never be the same as what it otherwise would have been.
Glenn, could I just jump in with a quick question here on the energy sector? John showed a slide before that the energy prices are moving back in the direction, they're moving up again. Mm-hmm. But if $50 a barrel, and I don't even think it's up to there yet, I think it's like 40 something, If $50 a barrel is the new normal, that's really bad news for the United States, which is so dependent on fracking. The break-even, they always said the break-even price for fracking was $60 a barrel. So that would be quite an upheaval if it didn't. Are you anticipating that as demand increases, they are going to be able to get the price over $60 a barrel?
The price of petroleum is so dependent on how fast the global economy picks up. Assuming the global economy picks up, yes, the petroleum price would pick up as well. It's a matter of how fast it occurs, because meanwhile, the cost of renewable energy is continuing to slide downward. And so the crossover point where renewable energy is cheaper than petroleum-based sources, especially for things like automobiles, the trajectory is pointing that the electrification, not only of automobiles, but electrification for heating sources, ground source heat pumps, and other things that use electricity more, is coming. And the crossover point is coming. And it's just a matter of when. What COVID did is it didn't affect it helped reduce that both renewable and petroleum industry temporarily. But the crossover, the problem is there's a matter of time for fracking to come back, because renewable energy is going to be marching on. It just got a delay. So I can't predict oil price. I don't know, John, if you have any more to say about oil price, but the COVID effect on technology adoption we can talk about. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the demand issue is really more the question, and that's, well,
also we got to hope that Saudi Arabia and Russia don't start having another price war, because the Saudis, they just stick a pipe in the sand. They don't have to frack anything, so they can. I read somewhere that Saudi Arabia, if they had to, they could sell oil for $10 a barrel and still make money on it. So it's going to be interesting.
It will be interesting. I think the evidence indicates that there's a limited time for them to be playing that game before there's too many other options available.
Yeah, and the reason I was asking about it is, we're looking at these huge sectors of the economy, and we're thinking, well, how are they going to change, or how quickly are they going to bounce back? But if some of these changes are long term, particularly in terms of the energy prices, you're talking about huge sectors of the economy that are going to be, they're going to be in a downturn.
That's right. All right. Well, let's move on a little bit to talk a little bit more about some economic development and investment. If we could go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about a few specific industries here. One that's been talked about already is retail. I think it's widely known that the retail industry has slim margins, has had a lot of pressure from online sales, from big box stores and big e-commerce. This has only been accentuated by COVID-19, but on the other hand, it's created opportunities, because the e-commerce has meant huge growth of distribution centers, logistics centers, satellite and supporting tiers of distribution activity, new forms of technology adoption for fulfillment and delivery. And this really means there's a workforce technology change. So there's economic development, there's opportunities for siting of these industries and their new locational needs, and there's also opportunities for training the workforce for these. And an important aspect of this is there's a spatial aspect too, which is, as this happens, instead of just mega warehouses in a few places, there's more satellite warehouses in cities and in small towns that create new opportunities for jobs. Next. So we talked a lot about reshoring, And the reshoring is not an across-the-board thing. There's some industries where it just never makes sense to bring things back to make them in America. But we've identified that there are many industries, and they're not just high tech, but now medium tech, where there's opportunities to not only develop more resilient supply chains, shorter distance supply chains, have more sourcing closer to population centers. And this creates opportunities not only for new site locations, especially those near existing clusters, but also the development of intermodal sites, by which we mean where highway and trucking combine with rail locations or air locations or marine locations. The opportunities here are for strategic positioning. If we're going to have shortening supply chains, we can have opportunities for investment, tax policy, zoning policies that can help encourage these sightings. And again, of course, the workforce training, which now is moving from the high-tech training to medium-tech adoption, where as the technology continues to expand, the electronic technology continues to expand to more and more industries.
So you would be comfortable predicting that we're going to have some expansion of intermodal facilities, for example?
Absolutely, and a lot of this is being driven by, we're hearing and going to be hearing even more about resilience, because the shock here that happened from COVID-19 is a warning of what happens when you have overly extended supply chains and too few sources of production. We've seen it before, of course, things like when there was I think it was the Port of LA Long Beach had a strike, and that hurt a lot of industries that were depending on parts coming in. And now we've seen how important it is to companies, major companies are, and major sellers and distributors for having more robust supply chains. So that's going to create new opportunities. And intermodalism is important because that's part of redundancy in how parts get in and products get shipped. So good question. Okay, moving on. Office space is a little more complicated situation. In the past, there was a lot of talk about higher density urban cores, tall buildings, reducing costs, getting more workers per square foot, hoteling and co-working to squeeze more people in, and high growth and expensive urban areas. With the movement towards resilience, redundancy, and wider dispersion of some of these industries to protect manufacturing, production, and distribution and sales of supply chains, there's going to be some movement towards more growth outside the urban core. Some of that was happening anyway, and those rural areas that have the sufficient infrastructure, meaning not only high-speed broadband, redundant broadband, and the lifestyle amenities to attract workers, have an opportunity to gain here. The chart here shows on the dark blue the absorption, which is demand for office space. The light blue is the supply. If you look at this, we see two things. One is the demand was exceeding supply through the second half of 2018. Through 2019, it started reversing. A lot more supply came in. It was exceeding demand. And of course, in the last quarter, demand virtually dried up and the supply keep on coming online. So that's part of the reason why the vacancy rate, after going down for a long time, has been creeping back up. It started in the second half of 2019 and is accelerating now. If you go to the next slide, we could
Glen,
more.
before you go to the next slide, just want to ask you something about the growth outside the urban core. I read an article in the Times. Apparently, 70% of the people in Manhattan took off as soon as the epidemic got bad because they had the means. They had the means to do so. But now, a lot of the young people, one of the demographic trends we've all watched is how the millennials like the urban environment, and you're seeing Dallas, for example, becoming a 24/7 tech hub. But in this story in the Times, they interviewed some of the young people who left the city, and a lot of them are saying they're not coming back. Now, part of that is the economic situation, but do you think you're going to have to rethink your demographic analysis, for example, of workforce trends?
Absolutely. That's a very good point. There had been, over the last decade, a lot of talk about urban professionals who never got a driver's license. Car ownership among this demographic was down. A lot of people in the tech industry found the urban core and the urban vibe a very attractive place to live. But there's been a movement already starting, of which COVID-19 gave it again a big kick forward, which was outside of the high tech, an interest in broader rural or small town America. There was a movement upward in that demographic in the last few years that's been documented. In addition, with the remote working coming online in a bigger way, that's also made it more opportunity created for this demographic to also work in outlying areas where they have more of an outdoor lifestyle. The issue, though, is many rural areas are not equipped to have companies develop satellite locations or workers to work outside of their headquarters. They need to have the broadband, they need to have the supporting infrastructure, and they need to have the other lifestyle amenities, I'm calling them, in terms of what there is to do, things to do. For
Glenn, we've got about Glenn, excuse me, Glenn. We've got about 15 minutes left, so why don't you hit your last slides, and then we'll see if we can squeeze a couple of questions.
Right. So the next slide is just showing in the longer term how rents have flattened. The rents are the orange line. You see how they've flattened in recent years because of all this extra supply coming on. You see the red line, which is the vacancy rate, after going down for a while, had been creeping up. And so these are the warning signs that were already happening. Rents flattening, vacancy rates going up, and COVID-19 just gave another push to push rents down and vacancy rates up. So this is creating the locational mismatch that Jack, by mentioning about the urban and rural, and we're seeing that not only is there a slowing of slowing of demand and an increase of supply, but the locational mismatch is looming as an even bigger problem for some areas, but an opportunity for others. Moving to the next slide so we can wrap up. Workforce preferences, the interest in dense urban environments, the opportunity for telecommuting and e-commerce. These are all being reinforced as a result of COVID-19. And so again, there's an opportunity for those places that can address the skill mismatch and those areas that can address the new emergent industries that we've been talking about. They're going to have an opportunity for growth. Now, this last slide talks about a mismatch of skills for workers in fragile workers, but there's not fragile workers. There's only fragile occupations. The workers aren't fragile. If they're retrained, they'll be fine. Moving on. The last implication we're going to talk about before wrapping up is tourism. We're all aware that cruise lines took a terrible hit. Large outdoor groups, large dense restaurants have all taken a hit. And this is all because of social distancing. Now, once social distancing ends, the demand could come back, but it probably won't in the same way. And the reason is that this is a lifestyle matter. What's been the in thing to do in terms of trends? Trends are very fickle. Trends change. Trends have changed. Will they ever come back? There's no reason to think trends have to ever come back to the way they were in the past, because trends move on. And that suggests that the cruise lines, the bus tours, and some forms of long distance tourism in big groups may never be the same, but there'll be workforce opportunities for new forms of recreation.
Glenn, let me just jump in for 1 second here. We're assuming, and I've heard this, and everybody's been saying pretty much the same thing, that it's never going to be the same again. We're never going to shake hands again. I mean, really? I mean, come on. They reopened the casinos in Las Vegas, and they went back to what they were doing. So,
well, absolutely, that's a very good point. Things will come back. But the rest question is, will they come back to be the exact same as they were before? And the
I mean,
reason why is that
hopefully
once
we
people are
learn some
introduced,
lessons here.
yeah.
Like,
So once
like
people,
don't evacuate people from a hot zone is one of them. We'll get into that. Listen,
yeah.
Glenn, I have a couple of questions from the attendees. I know you got a couple of slides left.
Well, I
but
could finish up because we're about to wrap up. Let me go to the slide.
all right, just go to the
Clearly,
last
the
slide.
takeaways we've already talked about it. Some industries are going to be accelerated. Some industries are going to be decelerated. Some are going to be delayed, and some are going to come back, but in a slightly different form than they ever had before. Because once people get introduced to new forms of recreation, to new forms of technology, that's what causes behaviors to change somewhat. Last slide and final slide, which is we can use the predictive measures to see some of the changes occurring. This will have effect on demand for land, for rents, and for locations. And those who are able to recognize the ROI opportunities, and then they'll have to face when they're looking for investment capital to make the case for it, they'll be in a position to gain, especially if they have taken the steps for the labor force to be retrained and available and ready for the new opportunities. And that's, at that point, we're ready to go to questions.
Okay, well, we've got a question from Stephen for Glenn. What evidence is there that mega fulfillment centers operating on the urban edge will be replaced with smaller distribution facilities in more urban areas?
I don't think there's any evidence that they'll be replaced. What there is evidence that as the industry continues to grow over time, there's being a more sophisticated development of primary, secondary, tertiary supporting warehouses and distribution fulfillment centers. There's been a movement towards more robust and dispersed supply chain options, including multimodal. And so as the industry develops, I don't think any of the urban ones will be replaced, but I think new ones in wider locations will be created.
Well, Glenn, as someone who is an expert on predictive analytics, what are the key benchmarks or metrics that you're going to be watching closely that you think will determine whether, I hate to use these cliches, but whether we're going to have a U-shaped or a V-shaped recovery?
John, do you want to take that?
Sure. I mean, to some extent, the conversation about V-shaped recoveries has been more or less kind of gone away. I don't necessarily I think that was very hopeful in the sense that, but we still weren't really sure how long the distancing policies were needed. We weren't sure exactly how long, all of this was going to happen. And so I think that really changed the narrative quite a bit. These longer term projections are showing, 10% unemployment through the end of the next year. So I think the unemployment is going to be the real big teller. It's probably the most current estimate that we get that we can really understand and kind of think about the actual expenditures that households will be able to make. And that's going to really, I think that's really going to keep us understanding the direction of things.
Do you think we're going to need more stimulus?
Certainly. If this lasts, I think if there's another outbreak, for sure, many sectors are really kind of on the brink.
Well, just to clarify, I mean, the outbreak never ended. So I know people are talking about second waves, third waves. At least in the United States, we're still dealing with the first wave. So it's, but as I said before, we just have to proceed from the assumption that there's going to be an end to this, and we're going to pick up the pieces. And the question is, how quickly can we do that? And I know that there are many factors that you're going to be looking at. Now, we also have another question here regarding the demand for office space. The shift is to vacate office space in the urban core in favor of work at home? Are you suggesting the demand will shift to rural areas and work at home will be reduced?
Well, I'll take a first guess, and then John can go in. There's clearly been the introduction of both work at home and a separate trend of the technology enabling more dispersed locations, both for people to be living at and more dispersed locations for satellite offices or satellite facilities to be located in. Those are two separate things, both enabled by the technology. So there'll be a shakeout, and I think it's not clear necessarily that these are like working in a satellite location instead of working from home. It's going to differ. It's going to differ by industry. John, do you want to add anything, or?
No, to your point, I don't think they're just discrete trends, and I think there's going to be movements in both direction. Urban real estate is certainly much more expensive. From a public health perspective, it's also not just your interaction in the office that presents you close to people. It's kind of how you get there. It's practically infeasible to assume that most urban cores would provide parking for everyone. It just wouldn't be possible. So you have kind of these two kind of aspects that are kind of pushing more of the state, work from home, and then kind of dispersing the labor force. So I think you're going to see both trends kind of emerge.
Just to take one more quick second, the urban COVID-19 will be over. There will be there will eventually be medications, but even when that happens, and even when people can come back to the urban core, because they've been introduced to some options and technology continues to expand those options, it's going to be a different world. And that's why we talked about the non-core office locations as well.
Tim would like you to give a couple of examples of restructured tourism options. I'm thinking of the car commercial I just saw where they're saying it's time to get everybody in the car and drive across the country. They didn't mention whether you get out of the car or not.
Clearly, one seeing, at least this year, there's been unprecedented growth in outdoor activities to do, in beaches and outdoor recreation and hiking and things like that. Those industries are actually are growing as never before. The furniture industry is reporting phenomenal growth in outdoor furniture, for instance, as well, and people's summer homes and whether they rent or own, whatever. That's clearly people have been introduced to the advantages of that option as opposed to going to Europe or South America for vacation. So they'll bounce back for sure. But the fact that people have been introduced to that may have a lingering effect.
Glenn, I wanted to ask you about the analytic tools themselves. During this crisis, we've seen some use of the standard economic impact analysis tools like Implan and REMI. These have been applied to measuring. I mean, usually you use these tools to estimate growth and job creation and wages, positive economic impact. But during the crisis, these tools have been used to measure the extent of the I don't want to call it a collapse, but the impact of the shutdown. Were they really designed to do that, or are we?
I'll take a quick stab. Yeah, I'll take a quick stab and then we'll turn it over to John because he knows a lot about these tools as well. These tools are based on the structure of the economy to show that whatever happens, positive or negative, there are knock-on or domino effects that go broader in the economy. And so they're very useful for showing what has happened or what could happen in terms of broader implications of a shock. What they're not helpful for is how is the future changing and how can we use it, how can we plan for a better future, especially when not only are the industries changing their composition, but they're changing the kinds of jobs they need. And those models have all that fixed. So they're useful. You'll notice that a lot of the webinars and things that these model people are doing are these impact models are the impact today. They're not about how do we plan our site selection for the future.
Well, that's why I thought it was kind of a mismatch, because you're really not estimating something.
Yeah, and so the predictive models are looking at alternative futures and what are the implications of those futures, because nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows the future. But if you have you take a look at the past trends, the current hit, and you can walk forward the kind of directions we see. And then with alternative scenario testing, you see what's the kind of robust investment that will likely protect our community or likely pay off for my site. By looking at alternative scenarios, we can establish what are the most robust investments we can make. John, do you want to add anything?
Well, I see by the clock that we have run out of time. I want to thank Glen Weisbrod and John Lee for a very informative and interesting presentation. This webinar will be archived on the businessfacilities.com website. So I want to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing or talking with you again at our next COVID-19 response and recovery webinar. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.